Hello, Gym School. My name is Kim Pennington, and I'll be walking you through the Teacher as Assessor. In this film, we will be looking at a couple of different aspects of assessment and the role that assessment plays in your classrooms. And just to let you know, I taught in Moore Public Schools for 18 years before I came to work in teacher ed at UCO. And in 18 years, I taught all the social studies in middle school and high school. So I have a lot of experience teaching and assessing. Although I would argue that when I went through teacher prep in the early 90s, the kinds of things we're going to talk about assessment and assessment today really weren't part of my training. These are things I learned as I went into teacher ed and through experience. So we're going to jump right in. Our compelling questions for this session are on the screen. How do teachers build meaningful assessments? What does that mean even? What does meaningful mean? What strategies can we use to gather evidence of learning? So what does that look like? It's got to be more than one quiz score or one test score. And what is the usefulness of evidence or assessment data for teachers? So we'll be talking about all three of those questions today. When we talk about the act of teaching and learning, we're really talking about four different things. We're talking about understanding as a teacher, who am I teaching? So we need to know our audience. We need to know what their abilities are. We need to know what their home lives are like. We also need to know, what am I teaching? What's the content, right? So what's the history? What's the math? Can I do the fractions? Do I understand the Civil War? Things like that. And then your methods are over here. How will I teach it? What are the best instructional methods for this age group, for this type of learner in social studies or in science? And then finally, what our focus is today is this last bubble. How will I know if students really understand? If they pass a test, does it really mean that they understand it? I know for myself, I've definitely passed tests and then not really understood it, right? Because there was something about that test that enabled me to guess well or be clever or be strategic in how I answered things that gave me a score in a test that didn't really reflect what I knew. So these four components are really what we mean when we talk about the act of teaching and learning. Even though they're in separate bubbles on the screen, they're really all connected, interconnected. So knowing if students understand really has to do with how you're teaching it, right? So what are the instructional strategies you're using? And then it also relates to, what am I teaching? What are the content standards that I'm teaching? This will become more clear as we move through the session. And you're going to see this diagram a lot in the session. So when we talk about alignment, when we talk about assessments, we cannot talk about that without also talking about the learning outcomes you've established for your learners and the instructional strategies that you choose to use as you teach to these learning outcomes. And you'll notice that these arrows are bidirectional. So as you're teaching, as you're designing your learning outcomes and you're picking your instructional strategies and you're actually doing those things, and you're aligning those with your assessments in ways that make a valid piece of data, you're constantly making adjustments, right? So these are all related to each other in multiple ways, in multiple directions. So you'll see this a lot. It'll become more clear as we move through the session. And just to be clear, what we'll be talking about in this session is classroom assessments, the assessments that as a classroom teacher you have complete control over. What we're not talking about in this session are external accountability assessments, standardized tests, Oklahoma Academic Standards tests, ACTs, those kinds of big tests that we have no control over. So our focus today is formative and summative, and we'll talk more about that concept later, classroom assessments. So for what you have control over, how do you ensure that your assessments are meaningful? Which is our first compelling question. So this first part of our film is going to take the longest, and we'll have a couple of breaks as we get to the second and third essential questions that'll be a little bit shorter in content. So how do we build meaningful assessments, and what does that mean? So here is my premise to you. 3 bullets. When we talk about the ways in the 20th century and moving into the 21st century, the ways that teaching strategies and technologies have changed, you can see all of this growth. You can see all of this really remarkable change in the way that we teach and the technology tools that we use in the classroom. But strangely, we seem to be stuck in some kind of early 20th century paradigm on assessment. So when you walk into classrooms, you might see innovative teaching happen, but it's often you will find the assessment strategy is a little bit old school. So basic quizzes, basic tests. So what we mean when we talk about meaningful assessment is how do we make sure that if we're using innovative strategies and technologies, how do we make sure that our assessments are also innovative, right? So these 3 bullets are what I would propose to you and what we're going to talk about here in this first session. If an assessment is meaningful for a teacher and a student, it provides both of those groups valid and strategic information about where student understanding sits on a continuum, the degree to which students understand something. Meaningful assessments are also aligned, right? So whatever your learning goals are for a lesson or a unit, the assessments are tightly aligned to those learning goals. And meaningful assessments provide evidence of understanding and of transfer. So that's an important concept we're going to dig into in this session. Transfer means the ability of a learner to take what you're teaching them about fractions or the Civil War or the color wheel or the periodic table in any of your subject areas and being able to transfer that knowledge into a unique situation, into their real lives, into a future situation that may be completely different from the context in which you taught them that content. So transfer is the ability for students to really use information that we're teaching. And it is often the part of teaching and learning that we leave out because it is not efficient. It takes longer to teach for transfer, but we spend a lot of time teaching for memorization, right? And memorization does not guarantee transfer. So when I use the term meaningful assessments in this session, I'm talking about all 3 of these bullets. A meaningful assessment is valid and strategic, it's aligned, and it provides evidence that students understand the content and can transfer it to some other situation that you may not have ever even dreamed of, right? So the first thing we're going to look at here is what does it mean for an assessment to be valid and strategic? So you can think about the classroom assessments that you are using now if you're currently teaching. If you're not currently teaching, you may think about assessments you've experienced as a learner or in the armed services. I know assessment is part of your programs where you move up and change jobs or train and things like that. So we can talk about classroom assessments in this, but you can refer to other assessments in your own memories that you've experienced. How do we know those are valid, right? And what does valid mean within the context of assessments? So here's the explanation, right? Your tests may not be valid, or a test you took may not have been valid if you exit that test and say something like this: I studied for all this stuff and only a fraction of it was on the test. That's happened to me a million times. I didn't have enough space to write answers. I didn't understand what I was actually being asked to do. We covered things in class that weren't on the test, or vice versa. Anytime a student says something like this in earnest, right, or you've said something like this as a learner, it's an indication that there may be issues with validity on the assessment. And those deserve an investigation. They deserve our attention, right? So when we talk about validity, we're talking about how accurate a score is on an assessment, right, or a rubric. So if a scale, for instance, if you get on a scale every morning and the dial moves, we can say that scale is reliable because it's working. If you start your car every day and it starts up, it's a reliable car, right? But if I get on the scale every day and it moves, so it's reliable, but it's not accurate, then we would say it's not valid, right? So if it's 10 pounds heavier or 10 pounds lower, then I have a scale that is reliable, but it is not valid. It is not giving me an accurate read of weight. In the classroom, we need to think of assessments as an instrument, like a thermometer or a scale, something that measures either on a rubric or with a percentage score what we can say with confidence a student understands about content that we've taught. So what we're looking for in a classroom is instruments that are valid. In the classroom, you will not have to worry so much about reliability. Reliability is something that big standardized test makers have to worry about more often. You won't give the same test to your learners over and over and over again to see if it works each time. That would be kind of crazy. You would not give the same chapter 3 spelling test to your students 10 times. That would, for sure, your principal would have questions for you if you did that. So we aren't so focused in the classroom for teacher assessments on reliability, but we have to be very concerned with the validity. Is the test I've just given to my learners, or the project that I'm giving at the end of a unit, is it yielding a score that with confidence tells me what each learner knows and what each learner needs to do next? And so there are lots of things that can interfere with validity, right? So if you think of your classroom assessments as an instrument of measurement, right, then we say we want a valid instrument that is accurate. If it measures actually what it's supposed to measure, and not, for example, how well a child can guess, or if English is their first language or second language. So classroom teachers really have to be focused on validity. Is there any other thing that could have produced this score that's not a reflection of what they know? And there are a million things that could be threats to validity on a classroom assessment. We're going to talk about a couple of them. There are whole books written about this, right? So we're just going to talk about a couple. So some threats to validity in a classroom setting. You might have poorly written learning targets. So the learning targets that you've based your whole unit off of may not be written clearly, may not be broken down clearly or unpacked clearly. And if that's kind of the foundation on which you're building your lessons and your assessments, so if these poorly written targets are not clear, do not capture what the standard says they should capture, then you've got a weak foundation and possibly an invalid assessment. And if your assessment tasks, so the questions on your assessment, or the tasks in a project you're having learners do at the end of a unit, if they're not tightly aligned to your learning targets, then you may find that your score on the test is not reflective of what a learner knows. So for example, let's say you have 3 learning targets, but your assessment tasks only ask questions over the first 2, then the score on that test cannot really tell you what learners know about that 3rd learning target. So assessment and tightly aligned learning targets are important. More on that pretty soon. You could have flaws in the way you're writing your assessment items. So I'm going to give you a few quick tips, and there's going to be a handout that comes with this session that explains to you some strategies for making sure that your assessment items, if you're writing your own tests, are written in ways that don't have threats to validity. And of course, there could be bias. There could be topics or questions or language in a teacher-created test that confuse a student, that distract a student, that upset a student, even subconsciously, that could interfere with their ability to answer the question. So then you're getting maybe a wrong answer that's not a reflection of what they know, but the mental processes they started thinking through on your assessment. So we're going to look at what it means to align. And the other real quick caveat I would say before we get started on all of that is, if you're inheriting tests, if you're finding tests or quizzes online, if you're using a test bank that came with your textbook materials, which I did frequently when I taught AP US History, it's really important to audit everything you find online, everything you inherit, obviously anything you're making, to make sure that all of these threats to validity are minimized. Don't presume that just because a test bank that came with your fancy textbook, if you're lucky enough to get fancy textbooks, don't presume that all those test items are indeed valid. It's very common in my experience to find official test bank items that are poorly written questions, right? So just a little note about that. So when we talk about alignment, right, so to make sure that a test or an assessment in the classroom is valid, we need to think about how it is aligned. And the best metaphor I can give you for this is thinking about the framing of a house, the architecture, the bones, the skeleton of a house. We want to make sure that every single joint in this house that we're building is tightly aligned. We don't want one joint. If this one joint right here or this one joint right here was off by 6 inches and we continued to build, we would have a serious issue when we got to putting pictures on the walls or trying to drywall or any of the other things that happen after you frame a house. So alignment is key when you're building lessons and when you're building assessments. So again, when we see this triangle, right, we want to make sure learning outcomes are aligned to our assessments. are aligned to the instructional strategies we chose to teach during this unit, right? So the first thing we're going to look at really quickly is learning outcomes. How do we make sure our learning outcomes are clear? And what we all need to do, and this takes practice, and this is a very abbreviated session, so this is just a quick kind of primer on how to do this. The more years of teaching experience you have and the more practice you have in unpacking standards, the better you get at it, is to look in your standard for the nouns and the verbs. This is basic unpacking of standards. So the example I have for you up here on the screen is a typical kind of generic around grade 6 reading standard, where at the 6th grade level we would expect learners to be able to determine a theme or central idea of a text and explain how it's conveyed through details. Additionally, we would expect in this unit teaching towards this standard that a learner could provide a summary of the text distinct from personal opinions or judgments, right? So just a clear, straightforward, objective summary of a story or a text. Later in a standard, you would probably find something where you're encouraging students to write with opinions or judgments. But in this one, it's just a straight up central idea and details and summary of a text. So if I wanted to unpack this standard, right, and make sure that I'm aligning my instructional strategies and my assessments, the first thing I need to do is look at the verbs and the nouns, right? So the nouns are the knowledge, the concepts that are in the discipline, and the verbs are the skills, the doing, the action, right? And I need to make sure that I'm clear on that, because if I have a standard that has action in it, that requires students to both know content and do something with it, but I don't teach the doing part, I only lecture to them about what something means, and I never actually instruct them or support them in how to do something with it. And on my assessment, I have some piece where I'm asking them to do something with it, then I'm not aligned. They will have never experienced the doing part in my instruction. So nouns and verbs are the most basic way to break down any content area. When I'm looking at standards that I'm teaching with, I will circle and underline those things before I write my learning outcomes, right? So in this particular reading standard, right, I'm going to show you a strategy for unpacking it. And just as a heads up, you will be doing this process on the reflection in the Google form, and you'll get to pick your own standard. You won't be using the standard. Pick a standard at a grade level that you're teaching. Pick one that maybe you struggle with, or one you really love teaching, one that maybe students struggle with, so that you can unpack it a little better. If you're not teaching yet, just go to the Oklahoma Academic Standards and pick an area that you anticipate teaching and pick a standard to play with, right? So here's what this might look like if I took this standard and I unpacked it, right? And I identified nouns and verbs, right? So verbs are going to be determining, right? Providing a summary. They have to be able to write a summary. And so I've unpacked this, and I've written 2 learning targets based on those verbs, right, and nouns. So learning target 1, and these are written in student-friendly language, so remember this is 6th grade. I need to make sure that I'm writing this in a way that kids get it, if I have to put it on the board or whatever policies you might have in place at a school. So you might find these written in multiple different ways. It could be the student will be able to locate the central idea of a text and explain how details support the central idea. So I've just taken this, I've unpacked it, I've written in student-friendly language. Not rocket science, right? It's all not quite word for word, it's changed a little. Sometimes it's useful to write your learning targets in the language of the first person, so a student can connect with those things, like I can locate the central idea of a text and explain how details support the central idea. Totally up to you, depends on your grade level, depends on how, things that maybe your principal requires. So I've taken this one standard, I've unpacked it, I've written clear learning targets, right? Learning target 1, learning target 2. And then I would use something like this to make sure, and this is what you'll do on the Google form, to make sure that I am aligning my instructional activities, the evidence and assessment that I want to collect, and what those assessments should look like, right? So I'm going to take both of these learning targets and put them in these first 2 columns. So it'll look something like this. So reading standard right up here is what we started with. I've taken my 2 learning targets. These are my desired results, right? If students learn what I'm, teaching in this unit, then they should be able to do these things at the end of a lesson or a unit. So if my learning target here is to locate the central idea of a text and explain how those details support the central idea, then I need to plan instructional activities where we talk about what a central idea means. That's the noun, right? What is the concept of a main idea or a central idea? And what is the difference between that and details, right? How do those, what's the relationship between details and a central idea? So in my instruction, I want to maybe do some direct instruction, maybe some things on some slides. We look at some examples, we define those terms, then maybe we read some sample texts. In this scenario, I'm setting it up in a newspaper setting, but you could use any setting. And I could have students read alone and then in small groups, practicing looking for central ideas, maybe circling those, underlining details, right? So these are some instructional activities that I would plan that are directly aligned to this learning target. And then I need to think, before I design this unit, before I launch it, what kind of evidence am I going to need to be able to say with validity that learners can do this, right? So I need to be able to see evidence that they can read for understanding, that they're not just reading out loud or reading to themselves and they're not making meaning from the text, right? So I'll need evidence that they can read and understand a text. I will need evidence that they can locate the central idea. I will need evidence that they can determine what the difference between a central idea and a detail. And I need evidence that they understand that supporting details advance a main idea, that these are kind of the foundational things for a main idea. So if that's the evidence I need, then what kind of items do I need to find on the assessment? So the assessment will need to have things like, and in this scenario, I designed a simulation in which learners are newspaper editors, and they've got 3 journalists who've given them 3 different pieces of writing about a local event. And the editor has to read those, provide feedback to the authors on their central idea and the details. And maybe I would mock up 3, I could use real ones, right, out of the real newspaper to tie in current events, or I could mock some up on my own. And then the editor would be actually engaging in the act of editing, which is a real world transfer, right, of this content standard to demonstrate to me. Then I could look at their editing, I could look at this completed assessment, and I could say with confidence if they can do this, right? So I would argue that your learning targets, once you unpack them and clarify them, if they're aligned to your instructional activities very clearly and directly, and you have gathered evidence and designed assessment targets that are clearly showing that they can do this whole concept right here. They know the content, the nouns, what a central idea and a detail is, and they can locate it and explain. Then I could say their score on this project is a valid measure of this learning target, right? And so the same premise on the second one. I'm not going to break this whole thing down, but I did the exact same thing. So this could be, maybe a week or so of instruction in English language arts where we're tackling this. And the next standard would build on top of that. And for this one, I've set it up in a newspaper setting, but you could use any setting, right? So when we talk about alignment, the first thing we want to do is unpack those standards, make sure our learning targets are clear, and then build off of those our instruction and assessment. Same, you see how this is working, right? So this is all related. We cannot just do an assessment session and focus on assessment without talking about these other things. They do not exist independently of each other in the classroom. Here's one more example of alignment. So for example, if I had taught 5th graders a unit on operations and algebraic thinking, and my learning targets written in student-friendly language are I can use parentheses to solve math expressions, I can use brackets, and I can use braces, right? So then I've unpacked my standard, I've written these learning targets, I'm teaching, and then I give a test, right? So this is what we call an item analysis. If you've never done this, it's pretty interesting. This was a 10-question assessment over these 3 items, right? And what I've created for you here is, let's say these are my hypothetical students in this class, and I've identified on my test that the test items, so number 1 on the test, number 2 on the test, number 9 on the test, and number 10 on the test are assessing learning target 1. So they are all questions related to parentheses. Learning target 2 about brackets are assessed by items 3, 4, and 8, right? And similarly with number 3, learning target 3 is assessed by 5, 6, and 7. And then this is just a binary chart. So after I score the test, I can put all my students in a basic table, and for each item on the test, I put a 1 if they got that question correct, and I put a 0 if they got that question wrong. And then when I step back and look as a whole class or individual students, I can say with confidence not only what their whole grade is on the test, which this would be their, whole grade, but I can say Maria, for example, seems to be proficient in all 3 of these learning targets. So I could probably argue, if I had a couple of other pieces of assessment evidence, that Maria is ready to move on to the next level, right? But Jamal, who did not bad, he got 8 out of 10 questions correct, but he missed item 6 and item 7. He got everything else right, but 6 and 7 tripped him up somehow. And if I look back at my item analysis format, I can see that item 6 and 7 were about learning target 3. So for Jamal, I can say this assessment tells me he seems to be confident and able to do learning targets 1 and 2, but learning target 3, he's not mastered yet. So this gives me individual information about what each learner needs to do next. Now, you may not be able to do this on every assessment. You may not be able to do this, you're not going to do this on every single little quiz that you give, right? But on larger summative assessments, maybe strategic ones that are really important within the larger framework of your course, taking the time to do an item analysis can really help you to ensure that your alignment in your test is connected to your learning targets. And if it is connected, right, it can tell me with precision what every individual student needs to be able to do next, right? What they're ready for, what they're not ready for, what students need more remediation and more practice. And clearly we can say, Robin down here at the bottom is really struggling. So Robin missed every single item on the test with the exception of item 1. So Robin seems to have some understanding of parentheses, but not much. And then these other items also not much, right? So again, when you're trying to make sure your tests are valid, aligning your targets to every single item on the test can help you ensure that you're not missing any learning targets, right? Or adding things on your test that maybe aren't included in these targets. So it's really basic fundamental architecture of an assessment. But let's say hypothetically I'm not going to give a test. Let's say I want to do a project, some kind of summative assessment that is project based. So I want to give you a quick example of what this looks like in one of my classes. So if you do a project instead of a traditional test, you still want to ensure that you are aligning your learning targets to the rubric. So if you're doing a project of some kind, most likely you're going to have a rubric that scores it. And the score on that rubric also has to be valid. I need to be able to produce a score on a rubric that says with confidence, with a validity, that this is what a learner knows and this is what they haven't mastered yet, right? So in this example, again, this is a college example. My students at the end of a semester, so this is one of their summative pieces of assessment, they're going to select a film that we've watched over the course of the semester. We watch a couple of different documentary films outside of class. And then here are the learning targets that I've created for this assignment, right? And I've got 5 of them. And then I'm telling the learners, here's what you're going to do. Here's how you're going to write it. Here are the text specs, right? That should be in APA format, 1-inch margins, all that stuff, right? And then I'm telling them the parts of the paper. But if you scroll down, you look at the rubric, right? every single one of those learning targets that I've identified up here, those are the criteria for the rubric. And I've put after each one of those, learning target 1, this is learning target 4. It doesn't have to be in order, right? So when I read that project, when I read that paper, or whatever the project is, maybe it's a poster, your learning targets are the criteria. And you'll notice on here that I do not have anything on this rubric related to the tech specs, because tech specs are not what I'm assessing, right? This is not an English class. This is not a class on research and APA. This is a class on sociology of education. And so I've got a yes or no item down here on the tech specs. And if it's no, it goes back to the learner and they have to redo it, right? So I want the score on this rubric to tell me exactly how well my learners are mastering these learning targets and no other factors. If this were a group project, I would not have on my rubric participated in the group, because that line of score is going to not tell me what they know necessarily about the content that I'm teaching. It's talking about behaviors, right? So when we talk about making sure that a project is aligned with a rubric, and we'll talk more about this towards the end of the session, I want to make sure that those learning targets are aligned to the criteria on your rubric. And then we can say with confidence that it's very likely they've mastered these, but then they scored low on this one, so I can say learning target 3 was not mastered, right? So pretty basic. That's what we mean when we talk about alignment in a traditional test and on like a project where we might be using a rubric. If you're a learner, this is what it feels like, right? When the test is valid or when a project is valid. This is what my learning targets were. These were the instructions, the instructional activities that I received that were all tightly aligned right there. And then on this test or project, every single thing that we learned was on there, and nothing more and nothing less. And that score tells me exactly what I know and don't know. And it tells the teacher what every learner knows and doesn't know. And then that teacher can use that data to make the next decision instructionally. Are we ready to move on? Are some students more ready than others? So validity is a really important concept to understand, and a tight alignment is one way to eliminate threats to validity, right? So very quickly, and then we'll have our first break, other threats to validity you might come across in a classroom setting are item writing and bias. So you'll be provided a copy of this document that's adapted from Popham, who's kind of the guru of educational assessment. He's done a lot of research, written a lot of books. We use his books in many of our classes, and it's got, for each type of item that you might be writing on a traditional test, strategies for making sure that you're writing test items that aren't confusing, that are clear, that don't enable guesswork, that aren't overly difficult. Just basic strategies for writing your typical kinds of test items. If your test items are written according to these rules, then confusion on the part of the learner should not be a threat to validity. So here's a couple of quick examples that you'll find on that document that you're going to get. There's a problem with this multiple choice test question, right? Important early theorists in the psychology of learning included Ebbinghaus, Thorndike, Pavlov, none of the above or all of the above. So you can pause the video for a hot second if you want, take a look at this question, see if you can figure out. There are actually 2 issues in this test item that make it poorly written that would enable a learner to guess and not really know, right? So you can pause the video for a second, take a look at it, check it out, and then restart the video. So when you've restarted the video, hopefully you figured out the fact that this question uses plural for theorists is a clue. And it's a clue that it's more than one answer, right? So that a clever student could figure out, oh, well, it's going to have to be all of the above, right? The other issue with this is the use of all of the above. So generally speaking, in test writing, in the world of test writing, all of the above is forbidden. When my students manufacture tests in my ed assessment class, they are forbidden from using all of the above, because if a student can see that more than one is correct, then they know the answer has to be all of the above. None of the above is acceptable, and you'll see that often in tests, in formally written tests, but all of the above is strictly against the rules. It enables guessing. So those are tiny little details that can really help you say with confidence that your tests are written um, in ways that ensure validity, right? Here's one more example. Here's like a typical matching from a science class. There are multiple issues with this. So again, pause the video for a second, check out the matching question, and then restart the video when you're ready. See if you can figure out what the threats to validity are. When you've restarted the video, you should have figured out, first of all, there's a lot of guessing that can be done in this matching sequence that a clever student, and I would argue you wouldn't necessarily even have to be that clever to figure this out, right? Um, there are multiple types of items here, right? So you've got a date, you've got a person, and then you've got uh, representations of the periodic table, or the chemical names for basic things like water and salt and ammonia. And you never, ever, ever want to have multiple types of items on a matching, because that gives clues. I know that 1938 is not water, right? I know that year of first nuclear fission by man has got to be 1938, right? I also know once I get to the last thing, if I've done numbers 1 through 4 correctly, there are 5 items here and there are 5 items here. If I've done these 4 with confidence, then I don't really have to know the answer to the last one, because it's going to be whatever one is left over. So when you write matching banks, it's really important that they are homogeneous. So these need to all be dates, or all people, or all concepts, or all events. You don't want to mix them up, because that gives clues and that's a threat to validity. And you also want to have items that are unused. So you would have maybe 6 items here. So when you get to that last one, they still have to know the difference between one or the other. And you also obviously want to make sure you're using matching for things that don't require higher order thinking on an assessment. These are basic kind of recall items. So you will receive, as a part of this session, this piece of paper that goes into all the different types of item writing to ensure that you're writing items that are not problematic and pose a threat to validity. And then the last piece of this before we take our first break, and then our second and third sessions are much shorter, is bias, right? So when we're writing test items in the classroom or designing projects, is there anything that might hit any of these 3 areas of bias? So maybe it could be racial or ethnic bias, it could be gender bias, it could be socioeconomic bias, which is very common and probably the one that is least, people are least aware of. So here's a couple of examples from Popham's text that would be typically found on a test that might influence a child and cause them to be distracted from the content of the test in some way. So this one would be an example of racial or ethnic assessment bias, where someone's talking about the history of Hawaii and how immigrant workers from other groups have worked there. Some immigrant groups, this last part is the problematic part, which of the following groups was the slowest to make economic progress in Hawaii? So if you have a student that is a member of any of these ethnic groups, they might read this question and start thinking about, oh, you know, my ethnicity is slow to make economic process or progress. And they may not dwell on it for a long time, but consciously or subconsciously, that could distract them from the content of the test, and then maybe cause them to answer the question incorrectly. So that would be an example. You don't want to use context like this unless it's required. So if you're doing a math test where you have word problems, you want to try to keep things like culture and ethnicity out of those math questions, because what you're measuring is how well they can do the math, right? So another one that I think is a really good example and pretty subtle on socioeconomics is a statement like this one in figure 6, my mother's field is court reporting. So you could have students who don't understand what the word field means within the context of work, right? So we tend to think of white-collar jobs as being fields. So that could be about socioeconomics, it could be about class, and it would be a good example of just a word that we might use without thinking about it that demonstrates some kind of bias. So again, we're not spending a whole lot of time on bias, but just want to put that out there as a threat to validity. So avoiding certain invalid items, right? Items that really don't need to be in a test. If you're not testing over religion, then there's no reason to put religious context in a test. Um, You'll also be provided a PDF of this Popham short article that Popham wrote on bias and how to think about it critically as a teacher in order to avoid it as much as possible in your, I would say, in your instruction, in your assessments, in a lot of different ways. So again, what we just did was we talked about unpacking standards, right? Knowing the difference between knowledge and skills, making sure that we're assessing each, working backwards from those goals to think about instructional activities and assessments, right? That's alignment. Making sure we're obeying the rules of item writing, so the matching, the multiple choice rules, again, you'll get that sheet of paper. And then very quickly we discussed bias and making sure that we're not inviting confusion into an assessment setting. So if we can say with confidence as we teach and all of these you become more proficient at these the longer you teach, then we can say, with confidence that our assessments have validity, that they're tightly aligned, that we've unpacked the standards, and the score on a rubric or a score on an assessment really provides a learner and the teacher with an accurate and valid point of measurement, right? So again, you'll be unpacking a standard of your choice on the Google form reflection. So be thinking about what standard you want to play with. So that's our first break. So pause the video, stretch your legs. We'll take a look at the other two essential questions when we come back from the break. And those will be much shorter little sessions, right? So keep this video going whenever you've had a good break.